Is that working? There we go. Thank you for being with us tonight. If you weren't with us last night, you missed a real fun conversation. We talked specifically about how technology has been forming and shaping emerging generations' view of sex and sexuality, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, and looked at some of the research and just some of the things that happen with our brains from a chemical, neurological standpoint, and how technology has really found ways to manipulate that. Tonight is intended to be a very practical session, and last night and even yesterday morning, I felt like there's a lot of information to get through, and I really like more discussion-based classes. I feel like they're more practical and beneficial, and I feel like I get to learn. So I'm hoping that tonight lends itself to more of that. Tonight we're going to be talking about how do we engage in conversation, particularly with younger generations when it comes to talking about technology, some of these dangers and some of the things that we're looking at. In my mind, well, growing up, when it came to like the sex talk, it was always about the talk, right? And it was sort of centered around something that had to do with birds and bees. I never got that part of it. But it was always called the talk, which is singular. I don't think that's the way that we need to think about these things. I think these conversations, not just about sexual things, but about technology, need to be an ongoing conversation in the lives of our kids at each stage of development. I'll give you an example. Years ago, when I was in youth ministry, we had a class called Cults and Denominations, where we went through and we looked at a bunch of different groups, religious groups, what they believed, what their convictions were. We compared that with Scripture. We tried to reaffirm why we were teaching the things we were teaching with our teenagers. Spent like 13 weeks. Did a lot of research. Felt really good about it. 2 weeks after that class, one of our, she was either junior or senior at the time, came, and this was before class on Wednesday night. She said, hey, I was talking with my friend, and they go to such and such church, and they believe these things. It would be really helpful if we had a class like on what they believe and how to talk to them. So you mean like a whole quarter worth of looking into what other people believe? Like, yeah, that'd be great. Like, okay, well, I've never felt more like a failure. The difference, I realized, was for 13 weeks, I was trying to point her to something that at the time she wasn't interested in because it wasn't personal to her. But just a few weeks later, she had had an interaction with someone, and it made that very personal to her. So the problem with talking about some of these, discussing these topics with our young people when it's not personal to them is that it's probably not going to take very deeply. And so thinking that we're going to have a conversation, that you've said it, that means that they get it. We know, particularly as parents, that ain't how it works, right? Apparently, it's the 1,487th time that is the magic time where it finally starts to sort of take, sort of. So tonight, I want to talk about this idea of cultivating conversation. The older I get and the longer I've been a parent, the more I realize a big part of my role is to learn my children. And by that, I mean learn what makes them think, how they go about making decisions, not just telling them things, but to learn and to listen. And I like to think that I've improved a little bit in that. It's very difficult sometimes because they're children. And it's very frustrating when you as an adult who have your entire life's worth of wisdom trying to tell them, like, listen, I'm right here. Don't question it. Just trust me. Trust is not easy for us sometimes to trust God, right? And so our kids are going through that as well. So a big part of this is to try to help us find ways to cultivate, to constantly try to till the soil. We want them to ask questions. Questions are good. We also want them to come to us with those questions. So as much as you can, don't react negatively to any question that they have. Listen to understand what they're really trying to get at. And hopefully after our time tonight, we'll be a little bit better equipped for that. The first thing I wanted to start with is this idea of reward their good judgment in analog situations so that you can reinforce how that applies to digital situations. I was with some friends earlier this week, and their teenage son was with us, and we were talking about social media and some of the things we were talking about here. And one of the things I told him in that moment, which he probably felt a little bit ambushed, was when you start to make wise decisions, things like even cleaning your room when they tell you to, when you have the opportunity to do something that is a little bit outside the bounds of what they've asked you to do, and you choose not to do that, you choose to do what you've been told, that shows your parents that you are exercising good judgment. So anytime they exercise good judgment, reinforce that. I'm guilty a lot as a parent of really emphasizing behavior when they choose the wrong behavior. But I don't always circle back around when they choose the right behavior and reinforce that. Part of the challenge here is that we sort of see the digital world and real life as two separate entities, and they're not. As a Christian, we struggle sometimes to compartmentalize our faith, right? We go to church, we go to work, we go to school, we go here, but we're Christians everywhere. Like we belong to Christ in all of those settings. There's no compartments. It's all life. It's the same here. So we want them to think in terms of what characteristics do I want my children to have as they get older, or my grandkids to have when they get older? I want them to be honest. I don't want them to be prone to gossip. I don't want them to be easily led away by untruth. Those are good character traits. Those are godly traits. So how does that translate from the analog world into the digital world? We have to think in those terms, and then we have to find ways to explain it on their level, whatever their age is. So that's why this is an ongoing conversation throughout their childhood, particularly into adolescence. We're trying to mold not just behavior, we're trying to teach them how to think spiritually about life. So particularly when they make a good judgment, reinforce that and point it out. And then when they make a bad judgment, my daughter, not too long ago, she is a wonderful child, just really wants to do what's right and to do whatever. When there's a kid in class that just blurts out an answer without raising his hand, that breaks protocol. You're not supposed to do that. She comes home upset because he just blurted it out. The other day, she got a hold of, I guess it was my phone or my wife's phone, and took a short video of my son just being goofy. Nothing wrong with it necessarily, but then she somehow managed to send that video in a text message to me, to my in-laws, and to my mom and some other folks in our family. It's a little bit terrifying that, and she's 9, but she doesn't get any unsupervised phone activity as much as we can do it until they find ways to steal it. But we try really hard to make sure the rule is you never have a phone or a device without us there. But I didn't know she knew how to figure out how to send it. But she's been watching us for 9 years on our phone, and so it doesn't take much. So that was a moment where we sat her down and said, you're not a bad person, and so I don't want you to misunderstand me. I want to tell you why what you did has potential to be bad. What you did was not bad. You didn't send it to strangers. What the video wasn't a bad video. He's just being a goofball. He's 7. He's dancing around. But I want to explain to you why this is one of the reasons why you will not get a phone anytime soon. And I try to do it in a very calm manner. And in the moment, teach them why 5 and 6 years down the road this could be a bad thing. And I don't know how much it stuck, but in the moment, she seemed very receptive to it. It's not a one-and-done kind of thing. We're going to have to do that over and over and over again. The rule is you can't do this, and that's why this was the wrong thing for you to do. When they just, on their own, navigate to Google. The reason this is not a good thing for you to do by yourself right now is because there are some things on the internet that people put there that are not good, and they're not good for you to see. And you can't unsee things once you see them. So we want to make sure that you're at a certain age of maturity to be able to handle it. So it's a constant conversation, and when you have multiple kids, it's difficult because they're all at different age levels. They're all at different maturity levels. So it's not easy by any means. The first part here is I want to talk about the idea of permanency. We did a little bit of a devotional talk last night with the teenagers here about this topic, the idea of what is and what is not permanent. And this is especially important in the digital space because nothing is permanent. We had our 2 students that we used shaving cream because it was cheaper than toothpaste. But each one of them had a can of whipped cream, or not whipped cream, of shaving cream. And I gave them 10 seconds to pour out as much shaving cream as they could onto a plate and just make it like a race. So they pour it all out, and you've likely seen this illustration. Have your kids squirt out as much toothpaste as possible, see who can win. Give them 10 seconds to do it. Like, okay, you got a chance to redeem yourself. Whoever lost, I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to see who can put the maximum amount of shaving cream or of toothpaste back in the tube. Ready, go. And the point is that you can't put it back in the tube. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me is one of the most ignorant jingles we've ever come up with as humanity. It's just wrong. It's not accurate at all. Particularly in the digital world, when you put something out there, it's on a server somewhere forever. Snapchat became extremely popular based off of the lie that you post it and it goes away. First of all you got to do is keep your finger on it, screenshot, and it's there forever. And everybody who screenshots it has it. And if one person has it, then they can send it to everybody they know. And it goes on and on and on and on. Particularly when it comes to sending pictures of your body to people. I know you love him. I know you think he loves you. But you're 14. There's a good chance that changes like next week. So why would you send a picture of something that is so precious? Teaching them to understand consequence, particularly the idea of permanency, is really important. I saw a really good illustration. We're going to come right back to Ephesians, but I saw a really good illustration online. There's an account called Wait Until 8th on Instagram. I would recommend, particularly if you're a parent, that you check that out. But they post different celebrities all the time that have come out publicly with a stance on social media for their kids or smart devices for their kids and their rationale. This is Sarah Michelle Gellar and Freddie Prinze Jr. They were king and queen of the late 90s and early 2000s. And they have some kids that Sarah Michelle Gellar said in the interview, her kids are asking her for social media. And these are people that have made their living being in the media, right, being movie stars. She said, I explained to them, you're not going to get it. Not anytime soon, because it would be like you asking me for a Paw Patrol face tattoo. When you're 4 years old, Paw Patrol anything sounds like the right idea. Outside of Mike Tyson, no one can rationally wear a face tattoo in public, in my opinion. When you turn 6 and a half, when you turn 10 or 15, having a permanently affixed picture of Paw Patrol on your face does not age well, right? Well, giving a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old access to social media is the same thing. Why would I allow you at one of your most ignorant stages of life to have the biggest microphone of all? You can scroll through 3 or 4 news headlines and find at least a dozen adults that don't know how to do social media responsibly. Why in the world would we give something so powerful to someone so young? So I think the Paw Patrol face tattoo, that's a pretty good analogy. I've used that one several times. Ephesians 4:29 reads, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Too often, we have people who voice an opinion, particularly a destructive opinion, and it stays out there. As Christians, we're coming up on an election season. What we say matters, not just in person, but also online. Because if you say something online that's ignorant or that's not informed or that's not caring and not loving, that reflects on me because they know we go to church together, right? We're both Christians. They start linking these things. Our influence spider webs, both for the good and for the destructive. There's an app called Yik Yak, and it's been around for like 15 years. I did a class when I was in youth ministry probably 10 years ago for some of our parents, and that was one of the apps that we highlighted because it's geo-based. So within like a 5-mile radius, it populates everyone that has the app, and it's an anonymous, basically anonymous news board for you to post whatever you want on there. It is just pure gossip and evil and mean and destructive. It's super popular on college campuses. Somehow, some way, it's made a comeback in the last year or so. Adam, you guys have seen that? Yeah, USA? Yeah, like I don't know why it made a comeback, but it is, and there's just nothing redeemable about it, nothing good, I think, about it. Have you guys had any specific incidences that you'd be willing to share?
No, not necessarily. Just like you said, it's just a whole lot of like gossip, and it's all anonymous based, and so
Right.
it's hard to track who said what. But like
Yeah.
everybody's business is out there, and it just perpetuates a lot of bad conversation.
So that's another part of this that I think is important with the idea of permanency is also anonymity. When the internet says that you're anonymous, that's a bit of a stretch as well. But for some reason, when we feel anonymous, we also feel emboldened to say anything without restraint. And that's not what the Bible teaches either. Let our speech be seasoned with salt. We're taught as Christians to think a little deeper, to not just react to situations, but to respond in a way that Christ would respond. And some of these apps really, they don't leverage that at all. They appeal more to our emotions than they do to our ethics oftentimes. And that's the age in which we live, and that's the way they get more users. So teaching our kids at a younger age, not just how to react to situations, but then to think through how will this response echo in the future. Ask them, if you post how you feel right now, in 5 years when that pops up as a memory, do you think you're going to feel the same way? Try to find ways to draw their attention to how this scales up and how this scales back. The driver's license, when it comes to social media, to me, the driver's license approach is the simplest and probably pretty effective right now. In order to get a driver's license, what are some things that you have to do? Take a test. A test about what? Exactly. You have a manual, right? So you actually have something you have to read. You have to read literature. You have to pass a written exam to show competency. You have to spend time behind the wheel with another driver in the car. You have to be mentored for a time. And then, if you're at a certain age, the legislation says you may now you qualify to pass a driver's test to become a licensed driver. Now, if my 16-year-old does all of those things, but I know that they have a short fuse, that they can be prone to violence, road rage, they make rash decisions, and they're not mature enough, I will not let them get a driver's license at that age, because as a parent, I am the one responsible. Legislation puts in rules and regulations and guardrails based off of the general physical and emotional well-being of the entire population. Legislation is never concerned with my soul or my family's souls. But we are, right, as God's people. So when it comes to social media, we're just now getting legislation that's trying to be passed to restrict social media to 16 or older. 16 is an age in which we generally think there's enough of the prefrontal cortex developed to make an adult decision on some level, right? But not all kids are the same, right? Not all kids are at that point. So as a parent, I think it's okay for you to give them some required reading. And the two of you read it together and then discuss it. Let them see some of these facts and see some of the science behind why now our U.S. Surgeon General just yesterday issued a statement. It was an op-ed in the New York Times where he wants to start putting Surgeon General warning labels on social media the same way we do on cigarettes and nicotine products. That was a big deterrent. There have been some studies that have shown that that's actually an effective deterrent to get people to reconsider smoking tobacco. This was the report that he sent out last year in May of 2023, and the op-ed came out, I think it was yesterday or this morning, I read it this morning, in the New York Times, where he wants to do the same thing for social media. Let's see, here are 4 books that I would recommend that I think are a good read for teenagers as well as parents, definitely for parents. The first one is called Screens and Teens by Kathy Koch. She's a PhD, and her book is connecting kids into this wireless world. So it's not specifically social media. It covers a wider range. It's a very short read, which I think is important when you put it in front of a teenager. Raising Humans in a Digital World, that's one that I would recommend you read as a parent or grandparent first, and then you can pull out some of those chapters that you could have your child read. Analog Christian is an interesting book. The first book that Jay, his name is Jay Kim, he wrote, came out in, I think it was March 1st of 2020, which is a really interesting time to come out with a book about technology in the digital age right as COVID hit. And it was called Analog Church. It was written more on like the minister congregational level. This is about the individual, and I love his subtitle there of Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. He does a really good job of drawing spiritual parallels to these particular challenges that we face in the digital age. Have your kid read that, and you read it together, and then talk about it. If this is the hurdle they got to jump through, and they really want that app or that device, make them jump through the hoop, right? That's a good one. You're getting them to read paper. That's a good thing too. The lost art of a real book. 2, it's something that you both can rationalize together. It'll be really interesting to hear the conclusions they come to versus the conclusions you come to. It gives you better insight into their minds. And their other parents, their friends' parents may not make them do that. That's okay as well. That's all right. We live in a time of intense tension, not just between teens and parents, but between parents and parents. Because everybody has a different approach. And the moment your kid gets a device before my kid does, there's some tension there, right? That's okay. In the church, we're okay having difficult conversations with each other. We're supposed to be. So we got to move past that. In his book, Jonathan Haidt, I mentioned him yesterday, his newest book, The Anxious Generation, he put forth 4 new social norms that he hopes will be adopted on a legislative and just on a cultural level. One is more outside play for children, particularly those in adolescence and younger. No social media before 16, no smartphone before 13, and no phones in schools. The biggest challenge we face in this digital age is everybody has to agree to a baseline of limits. Those 4 baselines seem very reasonable to me. They seem very reasonable. He's a PhD, he's a professor at NYU, so he's got some influence and he's got respect in his industry to actually get legislation passed, and there's a lot of momentum around that right now. So to me, that's probably our best step forward. Again, he's not necessarily coming from a spiritual level, but just from a childhood development level. Those are 4 reasonable responses. And then Glow Kids is the last one there. That's a good book, particularly about device addiction and how the brain patterns work, and so it's got a little bit more of the science in there. I think if you let your teenager read that and then you ask some questions, I think that would yield some really interesting conversations between the parent and child, and grandparents as well. If there's also, I've seen tension between grandparents and parents, because it's interesting, sometimes grandparents don't necessarily see the danger because it's still kind of novel to them because they didn't grow up with this, right? They're even further away from this digital age than parents are. And so even in our family sometimes we have things like Alexa that we don't have at our house, but the grandparents do. And so we have to have conversations explaining our rationale. Give them a book and say, hey, this is where I'm coming from. And this is hopefully will give you a better context of the landscape we're in right now so you understand where we're coming from as parents, and we ask that you honor our wishes on how we parent our kids in this particular area. And I think that would lead to a reasonable conversation. This was from that Surgeon General report last year. To me, it's worth repeating again. We looked at it yesterday. Children are exposed to harmful content on social media ranging from violent and sexual content to bullying and harassment. And for too many children, social media use is compromising their sleep and valuable in-person time with the family and friends. We are in the middle of a national youth mental health crisis, and I'm concerned that social media is an important driver of that crisis, one that we must urgently address. And to his credit, a year later, he's continuing to try to address it. Screen time. This is a big challenge as well. So let's say your child does have a device and they are allowed to be on it. How do you figure out screen time? This was from a TED Talk. Yes, Lord? Sorry. I'll scratch my face with this hand. Sorry about that. That was significant. This is from a TED Talk that I ran across, and I think it's an excellent visual to talk about time. So this graph represents the average life expectancy of 90 years if you're 18 years old. So this is the time you have remaining as an 18-year-old. Each of those, each row, I think, represents 3 years. Yeah. So the way this particular fellow broke it down, the top part there is sleep. Roughly 288 months of 24-hour days, 7 days a week. For 288 months, you're going to spend asleep. The next portion of your life is going to be spent in work and in school. 126 straight months of work and school. You're going to spend 18 months driving. You're going to spend 36 months cooking and eating. Mine would be more the eating than the cooking, but nonetheless, you get the idea here. And chores and errands, around 36 months of your life. In the bathroom and hygiene, 27 months. Teenage boys, that'll be probably a lot less on the hygiene end. But then you have this leftover amount of 334 months, which is roughly a third of this chart. Based off of the current average, well, I guess the average, this was in 2022, I believe, the average at that time, screen time of a teenager, these black dots represent how much time. 334 months of free time, 312 of those will be spent on a device. And when you look at this, that is staggering. Kids are visual. I think using images like this are really, really helpful for them to understand that you're talking about a third of your life you're going to spend looking at a phone or at a screen. That's more time than sleep. It's more time than sleep combined with a bunch of those other ones. More time than work, school, cooking, eating, bathroom, hygiene, driving, and chores all together. It's a very sobering thought. As young as possible, for as long as possible, send them outside. If you're not comfortable with them drinking from the hose anymore, send them with a bottle of water. We are very blessed, and one of the reasons why we stay exactly where we are in our home is that across the street is another family. We have very similar spiritual convictions. We have kids that are very similar ages. Almost every day they go to their house for the trampoline, they come to our backyard for the swing set and the playhouse. And we love that because they spend time outside. In Jonathan Haidt's book and a bunch of other research that I read before that came out, there is so much value to young children having unsupervised outside play with other kids. The playground, pretending stuff. Think back to all the movies of the 80s. The Goonies, the Rookie of the Year is one of my favorite in the 90s. Like all these movies with young kids, and it's all about the young kids. They're by themselves. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, they traveled the jungle of their backyard by themselves, right? So maybe bad example there, but still, you get the point. Like there's a lot of intangible positive growth that comes from not having an automated life and a non-digital life. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we did. So it's funny because like on every Sunday, your screen time will pop up and tell you how much time you've been on it.
Yeah.
Average on a day. And so a couple years ago in my position meeting, I didn't allow cell phones in my position meeting for similar reasons.
Mhm.
I wouldn't allow cell phones in school. And so they were complaining about it one day, and I said, all right, well, bring your cell phone in to the position meeting, and we're going to try something. So they all brought it in, and I said, all right, everybody go to your settings, go to your screen time, and pull it up. Average on a day, it was between 8:30 and 9:15 hours. 8 hours and 30 minutes, or 9 hours and 15 minutes that they spent on their phone. And those were 18 to 22 years.
That's a full-time job plus a little overtime.
Exactly. And so I was like, so you want to know why I don't allow cell
Yeah.
phones in my position meeting for 45 minutes? It's because you guys already spend 9 hours.
Right. Yeah.
And so that to me is very similar to what you're talking about.
Exactly. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. For those that didn't hear, or those that are with us online, what he was saying is in his position coach meetings for the football team at USA, he told no phones. And they asked why no phones, and it's because they were spending 8 to 9 hours, almost 9.5 hours on their phone a day. That is a full-time job spent staring at a screen. When you look at your phone, do things tend to move slowly or quickly? Pretty quick, right? I don't have stats, but I feel pretty positive there's probably a rise in carpal tunnel syndrome in the younger generations because we do this all the time. I mentioned Tristan Harris and a guy that does co-hosts a podcast with him. That his co-host created the Infinite Scroll, and the Infinite Scroll is a bottomless pit of content. It's meant to keep our attention. I saw one study that said the average human attention span is now less than that of a goldfish. I mean, that's a baked cheese cheddar cracker. Like, that's ridiculous. No, I'm just kidding. The actual fish, it's less than a goldfish. I mean, like Dory can pay attention longer than we can, right? It's an attention economy that we live in, and so there are lots of benefits from just getting away from the screen. Just the light of it has impacts on our eyes and our brains and all that kind of stuff. Any other thoughts to share on that? That's a great comment. Thank you, Adam.
I'll say one thing. I had a fellow Christian that told me a year or two ago, he was looking at a talk show, and said they had a girl just got addicted to the cell phone, and he told me, he said, Boris, he said, they just took the cell phone away from her and said immediately she just went to prison. He just was telling how bad that is and how vulnerable she was in that situation. So yes, we have to try to monitor that situation as well.
If you look at brain scan studies, the brain scans are very similar from digital addiction, pornography addiction, as well as opioid addiction. The brain maps similarly with all of those addictions, and programmers know that. How do you refresh your screen on your phone? What's the physical motion that you make? Pull down. What else do you pull down and let go and see what pops up? A slot machine. And that's not a coincidence. That's the same technology, that's the same logic that they have used to pull down and then see what pops up. Because when you're playing the lottery, or not playing the lottery, when you're pulling a slot machine down, It doesn't all the numbers don't appear at once, do they? It's one at a time. That builds anticipation, that floods your brain with dopamine with each stop of each number. So it's the same thing on a phone when you pull down, their brain is going, ooh, shot of dopamine. There's something new coming. I crave that. And so it's always the promise of more. That Molecule of More is another book I would recommend. It's all about how dopamine works in our brains. The more we learn ourselves, the better capable we are of teaching our children how their brain is working. And that's why these technologies are so dangerous, is because they already know that, and they manipulate that. In James 4:14, we read, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." Time is very, very valuable. And it's one of the things that you take for granted the most the younger you are, because you assume that there's always time. The older we get, the more we realize that is far from the case. So teaching them to think in terms of eternity and not infinite scroll is really important. I think this is a very simple but a very profound question that I don't always have a great answer to. But I think it's a question that's good to bring up on a regular basis, particularly with emerging generations. What is your purpose for technology? How would you answer that? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. How old is he, if you don't mind me asking? 15, okay. Yeah, so the question is, her son, he's 15 years old and got an Elon Musk award at school for being very tech savvy and very knowledgeable. He says that technology helps people, and she has seen an addictive behavior in his behavioral pattern. So how do you rebuff that? How would you respond to that? How would you respond to a 15-year-old that says, but there's so much good that comes from technology? Yes, sir.
So I think challenge that I'm working kids quite a bit. One of the big challenges is not, like you shared earlier, it's not a one-time conversation.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing conversation that there's other, some of the kids I've worked with, there's other hidden things they've lost, whether it's going out to play soccer, and in deeper conversations, you find out they kind of miss soccer.
Yeah.
You know, there's areas there, and as that conversation evolves, you start finding out that there's a lot of things they miss. You know, I miss spending time with my sister, I miss doing this, but the addiction, that gaming system has been so impactful on them, they really don't have a sense of control on that.
Right.
But in the conversation that, you know, for me, it's, you know, 3 months, sometimes like a 3-month session, you sit down, you're talking through, and kids are identifying themselves what they miss.
Right.
And it's pretty enlightening when you do that. I think sometimes we're looking for that quick answer.
Yeah.
Stop doing that, stop doing this. And it is truly a process because these things are,
It's a matter of brain mapping, right? I mean, and if we're talking about training the brain, that's a deep thing. That's, like you said, it's not a quick and easy. It's not just, you're not being disobedient to you. There's a real addicted element there. All right, great insight. Who else? How would you answer that if you've got a 15-year-old that he's even known at school as being a great tech guy, tech mind? Which, when you said that to me, the first thing that jumps out is he sees this as a part of his identity. And so that's a different ballgame as well. It's not about device, it's about how he sees himself. It's something he's good. It's not different than the kid that's constantly in the gym working out who sees himself as a stud athlete, right? So that's a big part. We'll come back to that in just a second. Yes, sir. Well, technology really caters to the introvert in a big way, because you can now be connected without having to interact face to face. I would start with a study on the fruit of the Spirit. And I would ask him, how is this technology cultivating the fruit of the Spirit in your life? In what ways do you feel like you are more like Christ spending so much time? Is it phone? Is it tablet? Is it gaming or just computers, all the things? Okay. Again, to his point, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but that, I think, is a good place to start on the spiritual side of things. Do you feel like you are more or less anxious? Are you more or less patient when you spend 5, 6, 7, 9 hours on some kind of technology? And then I would find activities for you and him to do together without technology, to have shared experiences as much as you can. And I know if they're not outdoorsy, if they're not sportsy, then that in and of itself is a bit of a challenge. But find an element of his interest that you can somehow get away from. If he likes to game, then do a board game, or try to find some of those things to pull with regularity, and reward that. Put a light on those behaviors that are outside the digital space. I live in Huntsville. It's a very digital town. We have some really competitive robotics teams, which is a thing now, right? And those are valuable things. I don't discount that. I have one son that's very engineer-minded. He will likely participate in that. Keeping balance is really important, and I think that is the emphasis. What kind of work does your husband do? Is he in a tech field? Construction. Okay. Oh, there you go. And you do it with your hands, right? Right. Yeah. I from the spiritual standpoint, I think that's a place to start. The fruit of the Spirit, to me, is what I'm trying to start doing in my own life. There you go. How does your app or device cultivate the fruit of the Spirit? That's a big place for us as Christians to learn how to discern behaviors are good or bad for us, to discern whether or not being around certain people are good or bad for us. Is it cultivating love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness? Am I more like Christ as a result of this app or this activity or this job or whatever? And if I'm not, if the answer is no, then that points me in a direction for other conversations. How do I become more like Christ? Do I need to change jobs? Do I need to get rid of this device, this app? 15-year-olds, logic doesn't usually have a place in conversation with them from time to time. So some of it is the emotional side. He's connected to this, I would assume, on an identity standpoint, and he clearly has a relationship. He sees his device as a part of the relationship to his other friends. Invite them over to your home to be a place for them to gather. Y'all do all that? Okay, well, I got nothing for you. You're doing great. You're doing great. Prayer. That's why it's hard. That's why it's really hard, because it's so, especially by the time they're 15, 18, 20 years old, the behaviors are so deeply ingrained. It's how they think. And so you have to slowly pull those layers back. Some of those books may be helpful, and just say, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, that's right. Yep. Guinea pigs, yeah. Yep. Right. Have you finished The Anxious Generation? Okay. I think by the time you get to the end of the book, Height will give you a little bit more confidence, at least, in where you're at. When it comes to, I don't know if you've spent much time around people with addictions, it is a constant roller coaster for a long time, even young people, because they're so malleable. Did you have something, ma'am? Okay. Ladies first, maybe? I don't know who had their hand up first. Okay. That still brings in the relationship, community, and Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I think a part of that plan is building in gradual stop gaps, because most people that are addicted, they don't stop cold turkey, right? That's not normal. That's the exception. So don't expect that. Temper the expectations. But if you did something like once a week or a couple times a month, invited his friends over if they game at your house together in person but not online, that is one limiter. He's still getting the community. They're in person. You're going to provide a spread of snacks and food, that kind of stuff. You also get to interact with them to build relationship with his community, his group of people. That's one step in his direction, while also it's a little bit of a compromise, but you're gradually going to be pointing him to the reality. What he's really after is the community side of being accepted by peers. So that maybe that's a way to start with a plan. And yes, sir, you had something else as well?
Just a little bit of background. I spent 45 years in technology. Go back,
So it's your fault, guy.
and I've seen it all the changes,
Yeah.
back to those mainframe computers, only handful of people, all the way
Right.
to the current environment where I'm tired of 5 years ago. But one of the things that I stress to multiple generations that talk about is that technology does benefit people. But
Right.
we don't need to use technology just for the sake of using technology. I've watched people try to solve problems using elaborate technology that could have been solved, analog
Yeah.
with just a few choice conversations.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we always kind of stress in all the years that I've worked in the team was that we don't just use technology for technology's sake. And there is benefit in using technology, but there's sometimes you're better off not using technology. You can solve the problem better without technology.
Yeah.
You talk about, my wife always said for the last 27 years that I was the chief nerd. The health system I worked at, I said, no, I was the chief nerd, I was the chief geek, because usually the nerd is not really technology.
Thank you for clarifying. That's good to know. Yeah. I like to say that technology is a tool to steward, not a relationship to cultivate. And as the adults in the room, we have to model how to steward it, to use it, leverage it for good, but also keep it in its place. It amplifies what's in our hearts, and our brains are deeply connected to our hearts. So maybe as we keep going through this, we'll have some more productive answers for it. I don't want to leave you hopeless. So at the end, we're going to pray specifically about it. This is one thing that I have become more educated on, because I guess I was taught this in high school anatomy, but I don't remember it. Brain plasticity is the ability for your brain to change through growth and reorganization. It's when the brain is rewired to function in some way that differs from how it previously functioned. It's teaching the old noodle new tricks. It is the way technology works. It wires us, and it gets us used to a certain way, and then for us to change our ways, we have to rewire our brain. It's breaking habits. It's forming new habits. When you break a habit, to your point, ma'am, is you got to replace it with something else, right? You can't just remove. You also have to replace it with something. And so when it comes to talking to the emerging generations, I try not to say young people, because then that acknowledges that I'm not one of them anymore. So that's why I go emerging generations. The prefrontal cortex, of course, is the front part of our brain. It doesn't fully develop pretty much until your mid-20s. So you get a lot of opportunities for 2.5 decades to do dumb stuff without being able to rationally understand the consequence behind it. Planning, decision-making, working memory, personality expression, moderating social behavior, and controlling different aspects of speech and language are all a part of the prefrontal cortex. So your 15-year-old, your 18-year-old, your 13-year-old, they really don't have the ability to make the decisions they need to make when they're dealing with technology that is godlike in its function and its reach. So keeping that in mind helps us to kind of create somewhat more reasonable expectations. The illustration I use, and when you're talking to your kids, your grandkids about this, I think it's another good visual. We used this in the Devo last night. If you walk through the woods for the first time, there's no evidence that anyone's ever been there. But if you walk that same path over and over again, eventually you're going to see a trail. This is kind of the way the brain works. You're creating you're creating an interstate system off of hiking trails in your brain when you perform different functions, when you build habits. And the more you think this way, the more you act this way, those synapses work together, the neuroplasticity starts to take shape, and you start to form how to think about the world. And so the more our kids show good behavior and they start building these good, healthy hiking trails, shine a light on that, build that up. I read somewhere it takes like 7 positive comments to offset 1 negative. So when they get in trouble for one thing, it's really helpful for us to also show when they do good, but you got to really show them that they've done good more times than when they do bad. The impact is different on how it influences them. So showing them how their brain is working and how technology is sometimes hijacking that or leveraging that is really helpful. If you look at your news feed find a shared social app that you have. If they have Instagram and you have Instagram, let's just for a second look at our news feed. Let's go through the feed and see what shows up. If yours has knitting and sewing and gardening or hunting or whatever, and theirs has all of their stuff, it's tailor-made for each of you, right? It's a reflection of your interest and what you spend your time looking at, and so is theirs. Technology is powerful enough to be individualized to everyone's taste. So what happens when you hear the same thing over and over again? If you hear exclusively Fox News over and over again, you're going to start talking like Fox News people. If you watch CNN or MSNBC over and over, you're going to start talking like those groups of people, right? That's why you should only watch ESPN. Just kidding. That's what happens when we get in these echo chambers. And so now you take a really malleable brain, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and that's all they're seeing and hearing, then they think that what they believe is unquestionably right. Because everybody else believes that. Everybody on my newsfeed says the same thing. Yeah, they do, don't they? You think that's weird? When you go out and about, does everybody agree with everything you say? No, because we're humans and we're messy. So getting them to think in terms of learn how their brain is working is really important. We talked about this in detail yesterday, but I think it's worth bringing up again, especially if you weren't here. This is another lesson that I didn't learn in Bible class and I didn't learn in anatomy class, and that is a bit of a shame. Oxytocin and vasopressin in the medical community are referred to as the bonding hormones of the brain. In the woman, oxytocin is a little bit more prevalent. In the man, vasopressin is a little bit more prevalent. They're very similar, but they're also unique. When oxytocin floods a woman's brain, there are 3 or 4 times, particularly in her life, when they are at an all-time high, and that's one at sexual climax, giving birth, and nursing a child. Those are 3 moments of deep connectivity, deep bonding. That's what happens when we have intimate moments with people. If you have a kiss that lasts longer than 6 seconds, your brain is going to have oxytocin flood your brain. When you have hold a hug for 20 seconds or more, your brain is going to be letting go of oxytocin. You're going to be bonding to that person. So when you're sexually intimate with someone, that is a deep bond. It is intended to bond you. And I use the illustration of a piece of tape. In the 90s, we used the rose petal a lot, and it was particularly targeted at young ladies, that every time you give yourself sexually to another person, you take a petal off that rose. Well, eventually, a rose doesn't just regenerate its petals, right? That's not real, because you can be redeemed in the eyes of God. So in my mind, the piece of tape is the better analogy, because when you put tape on a piece of paper and you press firmly, it has a strong bond. When you try to remove that piece of tape, there's usually some trauma associated. It tears the paper, and when you try to reuse that tape over and over again, it becomes increasingly difficult to have a strong, long-lasting bond. Well, that's what happens when we trigger this reward system in our brain that releases oxytocin for something like pornography. You're now, from a hormonal standpoint, you're bonding to pixels and to images of strangers in a way that was intended to bond you deeply to another human in a marriage relationship. That's why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7 that husbands, your body is not your own, it belongs to your wife, and wives, your body is not your own, it's for your husband. Sex is actually all about giving yourself for the pleasure of your spouse. In Genesis, the Bible tells us that A man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's oxytocin and vasopressin. There is a chemical bond that you have with that person. The old saying that you'll never forget your first, right? Well, that's kind of true, because there's a unique bond that happens that first time. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not able to move on from that. If you have had a sexual relationship outside of marriage, that doesn't mean that you're unredeemable. It doesn't mean that you're lost forever. That's the beauty of the gospel, and that is the beauty of the blood of Christ that cleanses us in the eyes of God. There are some physical things. That's why Paul says not all sin is the same. Sexual sin is different. He's explicit about that in 1 Corinthians 6. All the other sins we commit outside the body, but sexual sin a person commits against themselves. So there are some physical consequences that are unique. But from a spiritual standpoint and from an emotional standpoint, doesn't mean it's easy and it's not a quick fix, but it is possible to be redeemed. And sometimes the way we've taught about sex, it doesn't leave room for that. So when we talk to our children and our grandchildren, again, this area in particular is an ongoing conversation at every level of development. I did a workshop at the beginning of this year at a church in our area, and my daughter went with me for that one. We had some friends there that she went to class with and everything, but I was up in the booth, and I was sending my slides to the guy in the booth, and the lesson on sex popped up, the word sex there. And she said, "What's sex?" And the other guy was sitting right there. I made no eye contact with him, just looked at her and said, "We'll talk about it in the car." Well, that came a little quick. Just didn't, here I am, talking about this with adults over and over again, and she's not expressed curiosity. Well, she's going to third grade. I probably need to be at the forefront of that. So on the way home, she never brought it up again. I prayed about it, and about halfway home, I said, "All right, I'm going to bring it back up. Hey, remember that word you asked about? Well, that's when a mommy and a daddy, after they're married, that's one of the things that they can do. That's that they can express their love for each other, that it builds a bond between them, and that's how they embrace. And those parts that we said your parts are private, well, those are the parts that are involved, and they're joined to each other. What questions do you have? None? Oh, good. Oh, thank you. Ask your mom any other questions, right? So I talked to my wife when we got home. She said, "All right, that was reasonable. That's good. Now we know where she's at, and we'll wait the next time she brings it up." But I wanted to answer her question, and I kind of wanted to go a little bit further and give her some terms as well, so that when she hears those at school, that's not the first time she hears it. This is the hard part, and if you're a parent, you understand. We want our kids to be prepared for when they lose their innocence. We don't want to be the one to take that innocence. And that is a delicate, exhausting, stressful balance that sometimes it's impossible. The beauty is that, again, we are redeemable as parents as well. When a child experiences loss, I've heard counselors say, only answer the question that they ask. And I think that's probably a good thing. When they're trying to understand someone's died, don't just keep going. They're going to reveal to you where they are by asking the questions that they ask. So answer that question. When it comes to this topic, I feel like I want to answer their question, and I want to give them something that points them back to me as well as an authority. And so we always end with, if you hear words at school that you don't know, you can always tell those to mommy and daddy. You're not in trouble. If we tell you it's a bad word and then you use it deliberately, then we'll have that conversation. But you're never in trouble to share with us something that you don't know, that you're not aware. We're going to be honest with you. And then that's the kicker. Be honest. Be honest with our kids. There's a lot of untruth that's out there that they're going to have access to. We want to be truth tellers. We want to teach them about that. So when it comes to sex conversation in particular, that's one I'm very passionate about, because, like we said last night, if we don't talk about it, it doesn't mean it doesn't go away. It just means we give everyone else an opportunity to give our kids answers. And that's a really important one for us to get right, because that's going to impact one day if they get married. It's also going to impact them if they don't get married, and their understanding of the role of sex in particular in our lives as humans. So this is the part where I wanted to make sure and open it up and have some time. What are some things that have worked for your families, or what are some challenges? Thank you for sharing your current challenges. Feel free to ask those too. And we're all a part of the group project, but we're also trying to help each other, and we all have different experiences and come from different places. So I want to try to leverage the collective wisdom of the room. What are some other challenges that you all have experienced or seen in your homes or even in your line of work if you're education or in counseling, that kind of thing. Okay, we'll go here, here, and here. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry. Hmm. That it has nothing to do with love, you said? Gotcha. Right. Yeah. I, it is just my opinion, so take it for what it's worth. I don't want my kids to ever see the act of sex outside of a loving, committed relationship. Hmm. Yeah. Right. Right. Yep. Yep. That's why, in my mind, I want to teach what love is. And I don't want to teach that love is explicit or exclusively sex. But we use that phrase, making love, right? The world has kind of come up with that. So in my mind, I don't know that it's wrong. I don't know that it's, I would not say that it's a wrong thing. In my mind, this may be a bad connection, but it's almost like the rainbow. I want to teach my kids what the Bible says the rainbow is a symbol for, not necessarily what other groups use it for. And so in my mind, we have to do a really good, repetitive job of trying to show them how the Scripture defines different, and love in particular. 1 Corinthians 13, that's what love is. And so it doesn't mention sexual relations in there, so to your point. But I also don't want them to understand, I want them to understand that sex is meant to bond a husband and wife together, and they are in love. Their love is at the core of their relationship, of matrimony, right? You don't have matrimony without love. That's, if anything, that Married with Children taught us, love and marriage, right? Go horse and carriage. Bad joke, sorry, we'll move on. So I'm not saying you're right or wrong. Yeah. Well, that phrase, making love, is something that I don't know where it came from. I don't know the genesis of that. But I know that does then make it sort of an action, and it's more than just that. I don't know. That's a tricky one. So I think teaching the whole of marriage is the right thing, and I don't think that excluding love from that act necessarily is wrong by any means. So. Yes, sir. The survey here, we had about 76 people that contributed to it. And if you broke it down based on generation, the majority of the average ages that you were exposed to adult content went from, I think, 14 in the oldest Gen X and Boomers and Silents to somewhere around 12 or so. 11 or 12 was kind of the average for the younger generations. I read somewhere recently where the general average today, first-time exposure to adult content, is closer to the age of 8. So that's a third grader. My daughter just finished third grade. She just turned 9. That's nauseating. And I've got boys, 3 more boys coming after her. And so it particularly is harmful to boys from the pornography addiction standpoint. It's particularly harmful to girls in the comparison body image standpoint. So the average age used to be around 10 or so. The first time I remember Justin Wilborn brought a Penthouse magazine to school in 5th grade. It's in the brain, right? Justin Wilborn. So I was 5th grade, around 10 or 11 years old. Today, I think it's probably closer to 7 or 8 because of how easy it is. You click on the wrong hashtag and boom, there's sexual content. It's not always explicit graphic sexual acts, but oftentimes it's lustful content, and that's where even the good kids are getting drawn in and enticed and staying up until wee hours of the night with these images that are constantly being put in front of their face. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that is part of the point, is that I'm responsible for my child's soul care. I'm actually responsible for their education. I'm actually the one responsible for their health care, right? And I think too often we put those things in the hands of other people. And so when you see something that you deem inappropriate, it is your right as a parent to act accordingly to that. The challenge I see is that entertainment has become so central in our lives because it's so accessible now. And we can hardly most of us sit through a stoplight without glancing at our phone and being occupied by something that also entertains us. When you watch a ball game, you can't watch sports without it also being heavily sexualized. They assume the majority of the audience is males, and so they're going to put things that they think attract males and sex sells and all that kind of stuff. So it is difficult. And to me, one of the worst places to be is the home screen of Amazon or Netflix or any of those. And so it's caused me to wonder, well, then just is entertainment too central in my life, in my family's life? And the answer is probably yes. But now that's a changing my behavior thing. And that's hard for me to do because sometimes I just want to, veg out, that kind of thing. So it is hard to stay on guard at all times. It is a constant onslaught. I will tell you this. Don't think that you can stay ahead of all the apps. It's just impossible. They come out so fast. And now in the age of AI, things are advancing at such an exponential rate, it's alarming. Our job is to teach them how to think spiritually about all technology, not just a specific app. We want to put stop gates in their life, and we want to tell them why we're doing that. We want to restrict bad influences, and we want to help them identify those influences and why they're bad. It's hard when it's their friends, when they see it as a relationship, and they see their devices as the pathway to those relationships. It's really, really hard to break that bond that they have. But it's a worthy endeavor. Enlisting the help of other people. I don't know how often you guys have here these kinds of conversations in a classroom setting. It's a good thing to do. We don't do it near enough at Madison, I'll tell you that much. Don't stay in just your group. Enlist the help of people older and wiser as well. People that have, if you've got teenagers, find folks that have 20-year-olds. If you've got 5-year-olds, find people that have teenagers. Pick their brain. What else? What other thoughts? Yes, sir.
I think sometimes we don't think through the process of how, mentioned Alexis, those systems, there's a reason this phone connects with the kid.
Yeah.
You're telling it, the kid is telling it, it's creating a little digital profile of what they may like or not like, so they're going to influence them. They're going to have pop-ups and apps and everything else that are going to come up that they already know they spoke about, they like. And I think people don't really make that connection sometimes, that it's listening to what you're doing for advertising purposes. It's listening to you.
Yep.
And it's going to tell you
Yeah. Alexa and Siri are all-time good cop because they do what you tell it. And so that feeds this now expectation that what I want I should have because I can hear, right? And so Alexa is at war a little bit with the parental idea of obedience and submission. And it's hard because it's very convenient. And that's the difference in an opioid addiction and a technology addiction is technology does make our life better. AI is doing ridiculously cool things in the medical field. It's amazing. But it's also doing some really damaging things in other areas. So that discernment is not an easy thing for us as adults, let alone children who are trying to figure out the world and how it works. That's a great point. Do we have any educators, any teachers or administrators? Curious to see what you guys have seen over time. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah, we talked last night. Sorry, I didn't mean to call you out specifically, but I am glad you're willing to talk. Yeah. Right. 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 There's a limit to your limitations. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's also, there's a lady that came up with a social media contract with her child. And there's an actual form you can download that. I should have written that down. I don't remember the website. I'll find that and share that with Andrew. But she has a contract where it's a technology contract, not just social media, that the teenager reads it and they agree to it and puts in parameters and you put devices up at a certain time. As a family, if your kid develops a gluten allergy, they don't go through that alone. Now the whole household has to adapt their diet, right? Because you got to get new pots and pans and things like that. This is similar. The whole house kind of has to adapt and change some of their behaviors for the betterment of really the whole house. So I think Habits of the Household is a book that I think Andrew mentioned you guys have gone through. It's a very good book. It helps to kind of create some good rhythms in your house. This is really hard, and I think that's just a fact. This is really difficult to tackle effectively because it is an onslaught, an ongoing, and so I think leaning into each other as parents is very, very big. Give yourself some grace as well, but also be relentless. There is a stage in a kid's life that our former preacher used to talk about. It's called the dark side of the moon phase, where about 14, 15 years old, they go around the dark side of the moon, and there's about 8 to 10 years before they come back from the backside of that moon there, and they kind of reestablish contact with you as parents. I hope that's not true, but I hope the coming back part is true. Our kids are 9, 7, 5, and almost 2, so I'm not quite to that stage yet. But that has caused me to have a sense of urgency to cultivate relationship and to cultivate conversations with my kids as much as humanly possible. So when they get to that stage where I'm no longer the primary influence, hopefully there's still communication, healthy communication there. I try not to respond in the moment emotionally to whatever they tell me, whatever they do. I try to ask questions to get a rationale and those things, but I'm not always successful. I'm an emotional guy. My wife is phenomenal at getting to the core of what the tantrum is and all that. I too often I meet the tantrum with the daddy tantrum, and I've seen how destructive that can be. With these devices, they're all in our homes. I would encourage all of us to consider how we can make our homes more analog for the sake of just having to do stuff, tangible things, and not let technology do things for us. And that's up to each of us to discern where we're going to do that. But then make sure that we articulate why we're doing that. Sometimes we forget to say the why, and that's really the most important part. We assume our kids know some things that they probably don't because we've not articulated. One of the things that he said in Habits of the Household was he used the term liturgies. And liturgies is basically the same short sayings, statements, and saying the same thing over and over again helps them. Repetition helps them drive those truths home. So let's create our own liturgies about how technology is going to have a place or not have a specific place in our hearts. These are a couple QR codes I did want to put up with YouTube playlists. These are various TED Talks and other interviews that talk about technology, that talk about sexuality, that were helpful. I found helpful in my research. And then in the Amazon book list, several books there that I would recommend. Those 4 that we saw earlier are listed there, as well as Jonathan Haidt's book and Habits of the Household and a few others. The disclaimer is that I don't recommend everything. The illustration I use, if I tell you the burger is really good or the fish that I had at Felix's is great, I'm not necessarily condoning everything on the walls at the restaurant or everything on the menu per se, but I did find some value in those, so use your discretion. They're not all, most of them are not from a spiritual standpoint. They're from a scientific or an anatomy standpoint. Any other questions or comments? I think that was the last one I had up there. I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here with you, and thank you for participating and engaging in these topics. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I'm still trying to learn about, and it's really encouraging to be in places where people believe that this is a topic we need to be talking about and are willing to share and are willing to study, and the conversations that happen outside of our sessions are super encouraging. You've got other parents and other Christians all throughout, at least the state of Alabama where I've been. We're all trying our best to do the same thing, to glorify God and to use the technology we have, the tools of this age, to grow His kingdom. And we want to be learning that. We want to figure out how to use those in an appropriate way and then guard against the dangers that exist. So I hope that this at least has provided some talking points. You've got a couple of great speakers lined up for tomorrow and for Wednesday as well that are going to continue to expound on some of these ideas. So I'd encourage you to come back and bring some folks with you, and let's keep the conversation going. Let's continue to become more effective as spiritually minded people in the digital age. We're going to close with a prayer, and then did you have announcements or just good? Okay. Let's bow. Father in heaven, we come before your throne tonight as disciples of yours, as parents, grandparents, friends, brothers and sisters in Christ that simply want to be more effective for you. We want to, as parents in particular, we want to guard against the dangers that we now know exist in this digital age. Help us to continue our education, to be relentless in learning ways that we can put in some safeguards and some stop gates so that good, healthy spiritual habits are instilled deeply in the hearts of our children and not the addictions and the other habits that Satan has so effectively used in this age. Help us, as Israel did, as you called Israel to do in the book of Jeremiah, to live in the midst of Babylon in a way that they create the culture that you would have us to create. Help us to do that today in our congregations and in our homes. Continue to equip us, continue to give us wisdom and discernment as we move forward, seeking to glorify you and to pass that faith on to the next generation. We love you. We thank you for hearing and for answering our prayer tonight. In Christ's name, amen.